Why is marijuana banned? Why are people still sent to prison for using or selling it? Most recently in India. There are total 15 million under trial prisoners in India, and out of these, 6% are under NDPS Act. In percentage term, this may not sound significant and huge, but in exact figure, this number stands at 500,000 under trial prisoners under NDPS Act. This is happening when the government of India itself voted on December 2nd, 2020 in favor of the United Nations removing cannabis and its resin from the list of most dangerous narcotic substance. And it kick-started the facetious debate back home on whether cannabis should be legalized in the country. Well, don't ride me so hard for using marijuana and cannabis interchangeably. Generally, there is no difference between marijuana and cannabis, and the two terms are often used to describe the same thing. The issue has also received recent public attention back home after a series of high-profile Bollywood witch hunt by the Narcotics Control Bureau and primetime debates over drug usage. The decision of the United Nations came through after closely reviewing a series of World Health Organization recommendations on marijuana and its derivatives. The UN Commission on Narcotics and Drugs zeroed in on the decision to remove cannabis from Schedule 4 of the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotics and Drugs, where it was listed alongside deadly additives like opioids, including heroin. There were 27 votes in favor, while 25 nations voted against the resolution. Ultimately, India was among the 27 nations that voted for the removal of cannabis from the list of most dangerous drugs. Now, before delving deeper into the history of marijuana prohibition globally, let's differentiate between true marijuana and synthetic marijuana that can literally go on to kill you. True cannabis is a plant indigenous to Central and South Asia, and it has been revered for its psychoactive benefits since ancient history and has been used worldwide for centuries. Its positive effects are well known and documented, and its negative effects are minor and manageable for most responsible users. However, synthetic cannabis on the other hand is badly named. It's a dangerous drug, and that has nothing to do with the cannabis plant. It is an illegally synthesized chemical that is manufactured in drug labs, and it has been making headlines and causing real troubles in countries around the world for the last few years. We are all familiar with Pablo Escobar and his $50 billion empire. It's most commonly known as K2 or spice, although it's sold under many other names like heroin, cocaine. It's usually sold in a form that resembles dried cannabis, but that's only a decoy. What the buyer is actually getting is a dried plant material sprayed with the designer drug. As I have just told you, synthetic marijuana are created in a lab, and that results in the perversion of its original subject, the natural marijuana. Just being known as synthetic marijuana has angered pot activists. Well, yes, there are dedicated pot activists, because the effect of synthetic marijuana are nothing like that of the natural marijuana. Even John W. Hoffman, the scientist who is often credited with creating synthetic marijuana on a federal drug grant to study the effects of drugs on receptors in brain on lab animals, has recommended that people don't ingest the compound as it is a synthetic cannabinoid. It is made in a lab. The compound was actually created in 1978. But the thing is, why should we legalize it? Well, cannabis smoking in India has been known since at least 2000 BC and is first mentioned in Atharvaveda, which dates back a few hundred years BC. The Indian Hemp Drug Commission, which was an Indo-British study of cannabis usage in India appointed in 1893, found that the moderate use of hemp drugs was practically attended by no evil result at all and produces no injurious effects on the mind and no moral injury whatever. Regarding excessive usage of the drug, the Commission concluded that it may certainly be accepted as very injurious, though it must be admitted that in many excessive consumers, the injury is not clearly marked. The report that Commission produced was at least 3,000 pages long, with testimony from around 1,200 doctors, coolies, yogis, fakirs, head of lunatic asylums, bhang peasants, tax gatherers, smugglers, army officers, hemp dealers, ganja place operators, and the clergy. That means what this Indo-British study suggested was backed by solid anecdotal accounts and scientific observations. But why is it banned so severely in the first place? Well, let me give you an American surprise. The reasoning of banning these drugs is quite absurd. Now the question is, who the hell made the world ban marijuana when historically it wasn't banned at all? Rather, it was quite extensively used across the world. Well, most of us might make an assumption that it's because someone somewhere sat down with scientific evidence and figured out that cannabis is more harmful than any other drug we use all the time, like alcohol and cigarettes. And somebody must have worked it all out in our best interests. Right? Well, to your surprise, it's not what happened. In fact, not at all. Banning of marijuana was the complete arbitrary reaction of a jerk sitting high in the office in the United States. In 1929, a man called Harry Anslinger was put in charge of the Department of Prohibition in Washington, D.C. Yes, there was a specific department for prohibition in the States, and that department prohibited the alcohol at the first place. But alcohol prohibition proved to be a disaster. Gangsters had taken over the whole neighborhood. Alcohol, which was controlled by criminals, had become even more poisonous. So alcohol prohibition finally ended. And Henry Anslinger was afraid. He was afraid because he found himself in charge of a huge government department with nothing for it to do. Up until then, he had consistently said that cannabis was not a problem. In fact, not at all. And according to him, it did not harm any person. And there, quote unquote, there was no more absurd fallacy than the idea that cannabis makes people violent. But then, suddenly, when his department needed a new purpose, he announced that he had changed his mind. He explained to the public what would happen if they smoked cannabis. He started to campaign hard for banning cannabis and looked for excuses in that quest. Henry Anslinger became obsessed with one case in particular. In Florida, a boy called Victor Licata hacked his family to death with an axe. Anslinger explained to the Americans that this is what would happen when you would smoke the demon weed, the cannabis. The case became notorious. The parents of the United States were terrified. But what evidence did Henry Anslinger had to back his claim? Well, it turned out that he wrote to 30 leading scientists on this subject, asking if cannabis was dangerous and if there should be a ban. To your surprise, 29 scientists wrote back and said no. Anslinger picked out the one scientist who said yes and presented him to the world. The press, already obsessed with Victor Licata's axe, cheered them on. In a panic that gripped America, marijuana was banned. The US told other countries they had to do the same. Many countries said that it was a dumb idea to ban cannabis and refused to do it. For example, Mexico decided their drug policy should be run by doctors. Their medical advice was that cannabis did not cause any of these problems, and they refused to ban the cannabis. Now, the United States was furious. Actually, USA is always furious when the other country don't do what the US wanted to do. The great Uncle Sam. Anslinger ordered them to fall into the line. The Mexican held out. Until, in the end, the United States cut off the supply of all legal painkillers to Mexico. People started to die in agony in their hospitals. So with regret, Mexico sacked the doctor and launched its own drug war against cannabis. The scientific evidence suggests cannabis is safer than alcohol. Alcohol kills 40,000 people every year in the US alone. Cannabis kills no one. For years, doctors kept approaching him with evidence that he was wrong, and he began to snap, telling them they were treading on dangerous grounds and should watch their mouth. It was the United States that began to campaign for a worldwide law against all drugs, following the adoption of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs in 1961. However, India opposed that move back then in 1961 and withstood American pressure to make cannabis illegal for nearly 25 years. Finally, the American pressure increased in 1980s, and in 1985, the Rajiv Gandhi government succumbed to the great American pressure and enacted the NDPS Act, banning all narcotic drugs in India, and created a separate department known as Narcotics Control Bureau that is so notoriously used or misused by the present day government. तो जो नेचुरल ड्रग्स इंडिया में यूज़ होते थे, चाहे वो आपके अफीम हो गया, गांजा हो गया, चरस हो गया, भांग हो गया, ये सब नेचुरल इंटॉक्सिकेंट्स थे और इनको नॉर्मली यूज़ किया जा सकता है। आज भी आप यूज़ कर सकते हो, इनसे कोई बीमारियाँ नहीं होती, रादर इनसे बीमारियाँ ठीक होती हैं। इंसोमनिया ठीक होता है, मतलब जो नींद ना आने की बीमारी होती है, बहुत सारी बीमारियाँ ठीक होती हैं। दे एक्ट एज अ पेन किलर, कई बार तो मेमोरी बूस्ट भी करती हैं ये। इसीलिए इनका रिक्रिएशनल यूज़ अलाउ होना चाहिए हिंदुस्तान में। प्रॉब्लम क्या है कि हम नेचुरल ड्रग्स और सिंथेटिक ड्रग्स में डिफरेंट नहीं कर पा रहे हैं। जो नेचुरल ड्रग्स होता है उसके अंदर आपके नेचुरल प्लांट आते हैं, जैसे भांग हो गया, चरस हो गई, अफीम हो गया, गांजा हो गया, ये नेचुरल प्लांट हैं। तो इनका यूज़ इनको नेचुरल मैरिजुआना बोलते हैं। दूसरी तरफ होता है सिंथेटिक मैरिजुआना, जिसमें आपका चिट्टा आता है, जो पंजाब में बिकता है, चिट्टा आता है, हेरोइन है, कोकेन है, ये सब बनाई हुई ड्रग्स हैं, ये लैब में बनती हैं, ये ख़राब हैं, ये जहर हैं बेसिकली। तो जो ड्रग्स होनी चाहिए इंडिया में लीगल, वो नेचुरल ड्रग्स होनी चाहिए, नेचुरल प्लांट्स होने चाहिए। और जो दूसरे तरीके की ड्रग्स हैं जो लैब में क्रिएट की जाती हैं, वो जहरीली होती हैं, उनको बैन किया जाना चाहिए। अब हिंदुस्तान में क्या हो रहा है कि जो NCB है, वो छोटे से पैकेट भी अगर कोई रखता है ना, जिसमें अफीम होती है, गांजा होता है, उसके खिलाफ NDPS में वही सज़ा है जो एक सिंथेटिक मैरिजुआना रखने वाले बंदे को मिलती है। तो कई बार आप बॉलीवुड की व्यू पर देखते हैं, जब छापे पड़ते हैं तो वो स्मोक कर रहे होते हैं वीड को, उसके अंदर वीड भरी होती है, जैसे गांजा हो गया, चरस हो गई, उसके अंदर वो भरा होता है। और उनकी सज़ा भी वही है जो सिंथेटिक ड्रग्स कंज्यूम करने वालों की होती है, कोकेन वालों की होती है। तो ये डिफरेंस क्रिएट करना होगा ताकि एक तो लॉ एंड जुडिशरी के ऊपर बर्डन हटे, कम हो, और एक पैरेलल सिस्टम क्रिएट किया जा सके। दारू से मरने वालों की संख्या 40,000 है खाली अमेरिका में, इंडिया में ये संख्या लाखों में है। हर साल शायद 1.25 लाख लोग दारू के कंजम्पशन से मरते हैं, जहरीली दारू पीने से, जबकि अफीम खाने से कोई नहीं मरने वाला, नोबडी डाइज। तो ये हमें फ़र्क क्रिएट करना होगा। दूसरा, आप इन चीज़ों को नेगेटिवली सोचना बंद करें, ठीक है। सिंथेटिक मैरिजुआना के लिए बैन होना चाहिए, नेचुरल मैरिजुआना के लिए बैन नहीं होना चाहिए। धन्यवाद।